those monies won't be there.
Right.
So what works is being ignored, and what is proven to be a failure is being adopted by our conservative government, which is just unbelievable. You just need to look south of the border to see how the war on drugs has been an absolute failure. Why our government is supporting this is unthinkable.
And the Department of Justice has actually produced 2 reports in the past 6 years that say mandatory minimums are not effective, they are least effective for drug crimes, and that over 10, 15 years of mandatory minimums, the public opinion on sentencing doesn't change. People are just as angry in the first place about violence, crime, and organized gangs as they were in the first place. But instead, now you're in debt and you have this prison population to deal with.
I don't have a personal issue. I'm supportive of mandatory minimums for violent crime.
Right.
And I'm supportive of mandatory minimums for those who are involved in organized crime gangs. If you're a senior person of an organized crime gang, and I'm fully supportive of mandatory minimums, 3 strikes you're out, for those people and those who are involved in violent crimes. But for these issues, they don't belong in the criminal system at all.
The question that I have with you, though, in regards to actual meanings of the word organized crime when it comes to legislation, organized crime is defined, correct me if I'm wrong, but a group of people committing an illegal act of 3 or 4 more people. So that being said, if there's 3 people trafficking a marijuana joint between one another, they could then, in fact, by law, be considered organized criminals.
Well, you'd obviously have to tighten up that definition, but that historically has been a problem. But I can't see it being a problem that if defining it as somebody who is a known member, an identified member of a true, organized crime gang, which would be Hells Angels and the array of the triad, the other crime gangs that we have in the UN, that we have in crime gang that we have in BC, that people who are known and identified members of these gangs, that's an entirely different ballgame. So it's just a matter of defining things properly, so you don't broaden the net to such an extent that you're somehow criminalizing ordinary folk instead of those people who are the problem.
So would you propose also changing definitions of words like organized crime, organized criminals, I should say, trafficking? Because again, like I said, trafficking can be considered passing a joint from one person to another. And with Bill C15, you could go from 6 months to 9 months, 1 year to a year and a half, possibly 2 years. So there's different definitions.
These are part of the problems.
Right.
And you mentioned the Liberal Party has been sort of forerunners in terms of Naomi and Insight projects. What does it mean, I guess, for the Liberal legacy of being, a party for Canadians, a party that promotes social justice and health, and supporting all Canadians, if the Liberals do support Bill C15 and introduce mandatory minimum sentences?
Well, we wouldn't be introducing mandatory minimums. This is a government piece of government legislation.
Right.
So,
but it cannot pass without your support.
Right. This is true, but the government could say that if you don't pass this bill, then you're going to have an election, and that would be a larger cost to the taxpayers. So we have allowed things to go through that we oppose only because the government has said that if you don't allow this to go through, there'll be an election. And we felt that during this time of economic uncertainty in our country, it would be highly irresponsible to invoke an election at this time because a lot of folks are hurting, and we need to be dealing with that issue. It is the #1 issue in our country.
Do you think
that's the terrible compromises that sometimes have to occur in this place, and politics is messy. But we can change things when we become government.
And as a youth and student organization, we're primarily concerned with the impacts on youth this bill will have, particularly people between 18 and 25. We talked about how it'll be lower level people that cut up. And do you see this as an incredibly negative thing for all these youth who are likely going to be caught up, who make up these small level dealers, the runners, etc.? And I wonder if you can comment on the impact this will have on youth.
Well, I think that's fair to say that this is going to have a huge effect, a negative effect on youth, and it is, to me, repulsive that somebody in our country today, a kid, can be picked up with the possession of a couple of joints, be prosecuted, have a criminal record that affects them for the rest of their lives.
Oh, and one of these things with Bill C15 is that if they have a couple of these joints, and it could be an 18, 19-year-old with their 17-year-old friend or such like that, and that triggers an aggregating factor, and they're looking at the possibility of 1 or 2 years mandatory in jail for this offense.
Yeah, I mean, everybody in our country should rise up. I think a lot of people are not aware of these implications of the bill. So, what you're doing right now is informing people, which is fantastic, and I hope that all Canadians rise up and say, we don't want this bill to pass. We want this bill to be changed so it really deals with public service, it deals with protection, it deals with fair-minded drug laws that treat people with respect and will reduce use and reduce harm and reduce criminality.
And CSSDP is here on the Hill telling MPs of all stripes, of anyone we can meet, that we're not going to let this bill be passed in our name.
That's right.
It's being promoted as protecting youth, but as we've mentioned, this is clearly not. It's going to be a negative effect on them. So,
right.
I mean, we're here on the Hill talking to MPs. We're just curious about what you as an MP are doing, I guess, to help us in this fight.
Well, I've been fighting on this issue for years to try to liberalize our drug laws, to implement what works, to reduce use, reduce harm, reduce costs, save lives, and I'll continue to do that. And on this bill, work with my colleagues to make the changes and put forth amendments and changes that will either make this bill good in the interests of public health, or failing that, defeat it.
Is there anything in Bill C15 you can see being good for public health?
Well, I'm going to, there's a judicial aspect to it too, so
right.
I'm going to, certainly speak to my justice colleague critics who are more versed in that aspect of it. And I've been focusing primarily on the minimum mandatories and
right.
the bill that I have, basically.
Right.
You're a doctor, and you obviously know about the medicinal value of marijuana, and how we have the medical marijuana access regulations that allow certain people to access marijuana and not be criminalized. One of the things with Bill C15 is that it doesn't make any references to the actual medical program that we have. So in essence, if this bill passes, first of all, people that have their exemptions could also be facing mandatory minimum sentences because there aren't any exemptions within this bill that have these people included in this. So we could possibly see somebody that's got a federal exemption going in front of a judge and possibly facing a mandatory minimum sentence because there was oversight and nobody made any changes to the to include these medical exemptions.
It's another big issue that has to be dealt with in it, to be sure.
The other thing to go along with that as well, with the actual medical marijuana program that we have, there's a lot of flaws with it. So in essence, there's hundreds of thousands of Canadians that should be qualifying for these exemptions, yet as a whole, Canada only has under 3,000 people with these exemption cards. So realistically, we're looking at quality of life for people that
it's a huge mess, isn't it, in terms of medicinal marijuana? That's a separate issue, separate from Bill C15,
right.
And that also has to be dealt with. But I cannot imagine.
Still inclusive,
yeah.
in that regard.
There's an intersection there, but that has to be dealt with because it's a more complicated, it's a complex issue that and I wouldn't want to mix the two. There's an intersection there to be sure, but that's a separate issue, and this government doesn't have any interest in pursuing it. We started that; it's imperfect, but when we become government, we have to improve it.
And if I can ask you about Bill C359, it's a measure to decriminalize small amounts of marijuana and plants. But there's a growing current in Canada. Opinion polls are typically at 50% in favor of legalization. I understand there's a growing current within the Liberal Party towards legalization policies. I was just wondering why you would pick decriminalization over a legalization policy.
Because right now that would not fly in the House. You would not. I have to do what's doable and what's effective at accomplishing the goals to open things out. If I move a bill to a place that is going to fail, then I'm not actually opening up the debate and dealing with the complex issues around drug policy. So this decriminalizing marijuana is doable. Legalizing it right now is not, for many complex reasons. Part of it relates to our relationship with our friends south of the border, but also with obligations that we have signed on to internationally. There are international covenants that we have signed on to that would put us in violation of that, so that has to be changed in parallel.